Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and the Ukraine. Now, today we are hearing reports that the Russians are continuing an ongoing military buildup to both the northeast and the northwest of Kharkiv. It is anticipated that the Russians are amassing a force in excess of 70,000 personnel. This force, which is massing in several different areas, to include to the northeast near the town and in the town of Volchansk, and other areas to the west towards Sumy. Now, at the same time, the Russians continue ballistic missile or semi-ballistic missile strikes, cruise missile strikes against Ukrainian forces located in Kharkiv. Now, there was a recent report in which the Russians allegedly struck a busy marketplace. Now, we are hearing that in addition to possible civilian losses in that strike, that area in Kharkiv was a staging area, either for a command and control node of the Ukrainian military or being used as a temporary area for the housing of Ukrainian troops as they gathered forces in and around Kharkiv to be deployed towards the border regions and the ongoing battles that are taking place in these areas. Now look, in terms of casualties and what Russian capability is, if the Russians desired to rubbleize Kharkiv, they could do that. The Russians are in a position right now, not necessarily to attack Kharkiv with traditional 152, 122 millimeter tube artillery, but Kharkiv is well within range of the Russian 300 millimeter multiple launch rocket systems, such as the Smerch and Eroding. The Russians can strike deep inside of Kharkiv as we speak. They can hit any area, not to mention the Iskander capability and converted S-300 systems that are now being used. And then finally, the guided glide bombs. Now, the Russians have not started to use guided glide bombs en masse against Kharkiv. If the Russians decided to do that, again, you would see a much, much larger casualty figure. So when you see these casualties come in of civilians that have possibly, unfortunately, been killed in some of these precision-guided missile strikes that the Russians are launching, the casualty estimates would be much greater if the Russians were just looking to terrorize the population of Kharkiv. It's not what's happening. These are very focused strikes designed to go after Ukrainian military infrastructure. Look, the Ukrainians can't move their reserve forces, their ready maneuver brigades, into traditional bases that once existed in and around Kharkiv. They have to use civilian infrastructure to house and quarter its forces. And when that happens, that's when the Russians strike. And look, the Ukrainians are doing the same thing. We have started to see that occur with the ATACMS, with the Storm Shadow. It's part of war, and we'll continue to see that occur. Tactical nuclear weapons. It is becoming more apparent that the U.S. is starting to become concerned that the Russians are at least contingency planning the use of tactical nuclear weapons. So why would the Russians escalate to the use of tactical nuclear weapons? Well, if we see direct NATO involvement in Ukraine, then in all probability, at some point, depending on how the war effort goes, the Russians may decide to use tactical nuclear weapons. The United States used nuclear weapons in World War II. Not once, twice. During the first Gulf War, given the size of the Iraqi army, it was contemplated that the United States may use a tactical nuclear weapon. It was also discussed actively that the U.S. could use a nuclear weapon to cause an electromagnetic pulse over Baghdad. That was talked about. That's a fact. So right now the Russians are starting war games. And those war games include the use and readying tactical nuclear weapons for deployment against Ukrainian forces or NATO forces. Now, coming out of Poland, there's information that if the Russians were to detonate a tactical nuclear device inside of the Ukraine, and even if no casualties occur, that could be a tripwire for the U.S. to directly attack Russian forces. Imagine that for a second. Ladies and gentlemen, that's World War III. If that happens, right now, through what we're hearing from the polls, is that the United States is discussing a plan to directly attack Russian forces in eastern Ukraine if the Russians use a nuclear weapon. Now, that could be a bluff, but that's a big bluff. A massive bluff that, in fact, could lead to world war. Absolutely. There is a book out, and we're kind of sidetracking a little bit. The book is called Nuclear War. Now, you'll have to take some of it with a grain of salt. But a lot of it, in terms of nuclear effects, I think everyone should read this book or get it on a book on tape and listen to it. It's entertaining, it's interesting, it gives you a lot of information. And check it out yourself. But that's where we're heading. We are heading in that direction right now. I don't believe the Russians are going to stop this war until certain objectives are completed. And that's the defeat of the Ukrainian military. The Russians have a plan, and they are continuing to execute that plan in terms of destroying the Ukrainian military in eastern Ukraine. And you're starting to see the fruits of that endeavor already starting to take shape in terms of the collapse of the morale of the Ukrainian military. The Ukrainians are not recruiting. They are not able to expand their military footprint in eastern Ukraine. That's covering all the way up from Chernihiv all the way south towards Kherson. The dynamics on the ground are changing. And not just the fact that they're running out of weapons, but personnel has become a crucial issue right now for the Ukrainians. Because a lot of individuals in the Ukraine simply don't feel that ending their lives for what they perceive as a lost cause is something that they want to do at this point. A little different at the start of the war. The dynamic has totally changed now. In fact, at a certain point, I think we're going to see a political change take place inside of the Ukraine. And eventually, Zelensky is going to lose his grip on power. Now, will he be assassinated? Will he have to leave for his home in South Beach, Florida? I don't know. We'll see. All right, so that's where we set for today. We will continue to cover and report. Thank you for joining us. More to come, as always. Have a good day.